Greetings, everybody. This is Brian here with another supplemental episode. This time, so as we're recording this, DragonCon was last week and a half, 2 weeks ago. And while I was there, we did a bunch of panels, as you probably saw. But one of the other panels on the Trek track was a gentleman named Kyle Sullivan, who did this great presentation basically on the Prime Directive and its roots as kind of a metaphor for colonialism. And also, I'm going to let him do it much more justice than I. But basically, this episode is going to be talking about the ethics and colonial roots as a metaphor for the Prime Directive. So if that's not your jam, there's your warning, and we'll see you next week. But that's what this episode is. So joining me today is the presenter of that panel, who also runs the Trexpertise YouTube channel, which has a ton of awesome Star Trek content on it. Kyle Sullivan. Hi, Kyle. Thanks for joining us.
Hola, ¿cómo está? How you doing?
Muy bien. Muy bien. Hen hao. So thanks for joining. So I want to start off with just letting you kind of do a quickie version of the presentation you gave at DragonCon.
Okay, so the presentation, which was a lot of fun, a lot of great feedback from people. I was worried we were boring people to tears, but there was a lot of engagement. Is all about the Prime Directive and how it squares with modern anthropological and social science. And so just examining what we think it is against that modern scientific backdrop.
You mentioned in the panel that your background is actually in anthropology. Is that right?
Right. I went to school actually to study exobiology, and I walked away with like an anthropology degree and some minors and stuff like that, and then switched to filmmaking. So like
that's right. I started out as an aerospace engineer, and now I ended up here as in the film industry as well. Yeah.
You see, it's the industry. It collects eclectics.
But now, so my origin story or my path was definitely Star Trek, space, aerospace engineering, film. Was Star Trek kind of the origin point for you as well? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it planted the seed early. Like I really wanted to do the work that the exobiology people at NASA were doing, and they're just basically predicting like where do we look to find some kind of life. And I wanted to, touch that. And that seed was planted by Star Trek. No shame in admitting that at all.
Absolutely. Cool. Anyway, so your presentation was about kind of the colonial metaphor and the anthropological. Go ahead. I'm not going to try to do it.
I mean, that's basically the gist of it. Is like, so is the Prime Directive useful? Like, and I'm positing that it isn't. That it's based on a kind of outdated social science from the turn of the century about the progression of civilizations, these universal stages that we all in the public imagination think that societies go through, and that Star Trek really hammers down on in a way that no other franchise or property does, because of the Prime Directive as a thing in Star Trek. Like MASH doesn't care, CSI doesn't care. It only bubbles up superficially in places like that, but Star Trek like looks squarely at that problem, but then embraces like an absolutely outdated anthropological framework for that. So like how do you square that circle? And so that's kind of what the topic was about, and the resulting video essay, which is forthcoming, will dive into that even deeper, I hope.
So yeah, in your talk you talked about and forgive me if I screw up the terms here, but was it monolineal and polylineal cultural development models? It
was unilineal and multilineal. Showing you the imagination of academics. Unilineal being the suggestion that all human societies traverse the same universal stages, and multilineal evolution, cultural evolution, saying that the name of the game is merely adaptation, and that human societies can spin off in all kinds of random directions, and there aren't universal stages to pass through. And social science has caught up to that, being that the multilineal model seems to be what's driving the splendid diversity of human cultures across the planet. But in Star Trek, which both celebrates diversity and at the same time uses the unilineal model to explain how they became who they are, it's kind of a rather wild contradiction. To explore, more fun than actual Prime Directive episodes.
Sorry, you froze me. Yeah, I think you're back now. Okay. Yes, which is something that I find fascinating about the Prime Directive in Star Trek, and especially in its origin and its early days in the original series, right? Because it's always seemed to me like um it's sort of it sometimes this metaphor for colonialism, right? And the very beginning of our kind of modern sense of like, hey, maybe colonialism was actually kind of not a great thing. And it was just the kind of very beginning of that sort of awareness in popular sentiment, or in, you know, in the cultural mindset, uh but still like not really having a great handle on it yet. So you, as a result, in the original series, you get this very inconsistent, like sometimes it's, yeah, uh we can't impose our values or our way of, you know, thinking about things in terms, and then it attempts to exploit these people because we can, because we have the superior technology or whatever. But then also sometimes doing exactly that without ever really thinking about it twice. um
Yeah.
and so I had mentioned specifically the episode in our prep for this, Private Little War, because I
Hmm.
feel like that's probably the most quintessential example of both that dichotomy and that question, and looking at, and actually characters having a debate about the ethics of it. um were you able to watch, were you able to
Oh yeah.
rewatch Private Little War? Do you
Yeah.
have any thoughts specifically about that?
Ooh, what an
Yeah.
episode that was.
Yeah.
Doesn't hold up well at all, I'm
No.
afraid. But yeah, that's a unilineal model of evolution, a cultural evolution, and like unapologetically. They're at the flintlock rifle stage of evolution. It's like, what's going on here? Calm
Yeah.
down. Take an anthropology course. Chill out. But it doubles down hard on that, and I couldn't tell exactly if they were playing in Vietnam War waters or not.
Well, so what's interesting is that it is, as far as I know, the only direct explicit reference to the Vietnam Wars, at least in the original series, right? And it's so there's a speech between, there's a debate between Kirk and McCoy, basically the one scene about the ethics of it and whatever. Uh, and Kirk cites essentially, quote unquote, the Bush Wars on the Asian continents in the mid 20th century, however he phrases it. Um, he's essentially citing specifically Vietnam as like, it sucked, it was terrible, but it was the least bad of all terrible options, and that's why it's what we have to do here. Um, which which I think, like I said, I think is the most direct kind of comparison of the Prime Directive to uh, Vietnam, and therefore kind of the colonialism metaphor in general in Star Trek.
Yeah, I think that's right. I can't. It gets close sometimes, but this was pretty. This is about as explicit as I remember. And I just watched the episode. It's really fresh in my mind. It's been a while since I've seen a lot of the original series, but like,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like Kirk is doubling down on nationalism, or
Yeah.
God forbid that the Vietnamese choose a different economic model and run their money a different way. Like, there's no questioning any of that. It's kind of amazing, but yeah, it does feel very quintessential. I think the next generation probably dug into it a little bit differently, and they probably have a couple of quintessential episodes. But yeah, this one has all of the contradictions of the Prime Directive.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can't tell if it's useful or not. You have to do something, because if you don't do anything, then like you're going to cause more damage, I guess. And then like the unilineal model of cultural evolution on top of that. It's just like all of the 20th century social science wrapped up in a nice little blanket.
What's also interesting that I found in both in that episode in general is this kind of presumption of good intentions on the part of the Prime Directive. Like when you have Picard or Kirk or whoever always talking about like, you know, Picard has some speech at some point to the effect of like, no matter how good our intentions are, no matter how well intentioned we think what we're doing is, it always turns out disastrously, right? So
Mhm.
we think we're trying to do the right thing, but we have to stop ourselves even though we know we're doing the right thing, kind of a thing, right? So there's this kind of presumption of good intentions, and then when you apply the Prime Directive as a metaphor for colonialism, it it occurred to me like that's a huge discontinuity between the two, right? At least from our perspective now, right? So you know um a British British colonial officer in the Raj, India, or South Africa, or French Indochina, or whatever in those times, sure, probably may have thoughts. Okay, well, let's say that some of them probably thought they had good intentions or were doing quote unquote the right thing,
Oh
and
yeah.
others couldn't have given less of a shit about it, right? And but from our perspective now, well, from let's use India specifically as an example. From the Indians' perspective, from jump, it was always terrible, and only we, as kind of the Western European descendants, have recently gone culturally have been able to say, yeah, okay, that probably wasn't great, right? But we had fooled ourselves for this incredibly long time into saying like, well, we're doing it for their benefit. It's the is it Kipling with the white man's burden?
Rudyard Kipling, yeah.
Yeah. Kipling's poem of the white man's burden of we are the ones endowed with a superior civilization, so we have to go and spread that with, to all the poor savage cultures of the world, right? And you see this reflected in the Prime Directive, but then kind of wrapped up in characters who are actually, at least more noble in their portrayal to us than the historical figures that they are kind of echoing in the metaphor. Does that make sense as a statement?
Yeah, totally.
And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about kind of that discontinuity of, how evil and exploitative and terrible colonialism and imperialism actually was compared to this presumption of good intentions, or we're trying to help, that exists within the Star Trek version of the Prime Directive, and how those things align or don't align.
It's kind of like a backhanded compliment, like, not to sound racial, but like, you're pretty nice for a white guy. Like,
Yeah.
Hold on, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
And it's sort of how it feels like. A lot of the people that were animated by the philosophy of ethno or Eurocentrism, specifically like your British imperial officer, for example, is a great example. He probably went out into the field thinking that, I am doing good, even if I have to shoot a couple of dudes or, chastise someone or whatever. Like, ultimately, we'll be able to shape them and push them down their cultural evolutionary path, just like we march down the same path. And they may not have thought on an individual case-by-case basis that the harm they did in the physical on the ground to people, that it was a wash, or it washed out in the positive, because in the long term the effort would have been worth it. But like, it's the animating philosophy that is the most damaging, and trying to square those two. Like, it's kind of like, I gotta kill you to save the world. It's like a kind of delusion in a way. And when we all, if you live inside of a cultural bubble, and we all do, we inherently have a bias. We can't see outside that cultural bubble without some effort to do so. And like, social scientists, anthropologists, they're always trying to peer outside of it. But like, for most of us, like, we accept at face value the biases, unconscious biases that we carry around in our pocket everywhere. And for someone operating under a colonial system, of which I'd argue the United States of America still does, you don't know to divorce yourself from that. So like, you'll walk in thinking you're doing the best job in the world, and you end up doing more harm in the long run to a people or a society or an institution. And like, how do you square the morality of that? I mean, I don't know, man. Nazi officers are just following orders, weren't they?
Yeah.
It's only when you can get outside of yourself do you judge these unconscious or unknown biases by any kind of moral standard. And like, how often does that happen? And I'm sure in a colonial context it happened quite often, because like, when the Brits were moving into North America, they had a real problem keeping people in the colonies. The colonies were terrible. Like, the social order was awful. There was a strict hierarchy. There was no food, no women. People voted with their feet, and they went off into the neighboring native nations all the time. And that went on for hundreds of years. And so like, those people probably weren't laboring under too many misconceptions after time spent among people. But the powers that be, the people running those systems, for whatever reason, benefited from those biases unknowingly or knowingly. And can you blame a person for plugging into that system? I don't know, man. That's a really thorny issue, and maybe that would be a lot more fun for Star Trek to tackle than like your typical "let's give them flintlock rifles or not" kind of
Right.
Prime Directive moral dilemma.
Yeah, so it sounds like what seems like what you're talking about here is the sense of, being blind to your own blindness, right? So one of the better defenses of the Prime Directive in a couple of the episodes is its justification. Kirk has a quote at one point of, we're wise enough to know that we're not wise enough, right? So to understand that there are things we don't know, and therefore we're not going to screw things up by ignoring that our own ignorance, right? And so there has definitely been that aspect in the historical framework of colonialism, and like you're talking about, the people on the ground, the people who are actually there in the day to day, whether it was North America or Asia or wherever, would have been um, would have had a lot more opportunity to become aware of their own ignorance and blindness in that, versus the people, the administrators back home, the House of
Mhm.
Lords or whoever, um who so here's the other thing I'm trying to parse in my own head, which is the difference between the people, you know in on the colonial side, the people who actually would have emigrated to North America, or the colonial officers on the ground in India or whoever, like we're talking about the people on the grounds, um, versus the House of Lords back home, right? And how would that transfer to the Star Trek context? Because there's so a while back I was watching the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary, and
Good
I had
documentary.
it's a great documentary, and I had this thought that I had this thought that immediately is like, oh wow, that's fucked up and completely like, like totally, like, you ever have a thought and you're like, wow, that is really inadequate, like, insight into the overall arching, topic of whatever it is, right? So
Yeah.
essentially, I was watching early on, it's talking about the essentially the early French colonialization efforts of Indochina. It's talking about how the French showed up and were starting to share technology and educated about like irrigation techniques and construction techniques and all of this stuff, right? But then coupled along with that, it was this like monolineal view, your white Eurocentrists superior view of like, well, we're Christians and we're civilized and we're Europeans, so that means we're better, and therefore we're going to make you guys better like us, whether you like it or not. And it occurred to me that those are actually two distinct elements, right? The technology versus the cultural, or they can be, at least could be, two distinct elements. The sharing the technology that would have measurable uh, improvements in a society's life, right? So like, say the French showed up in Indochina and all they did was say like, hey, we figured out this thing called germ theory and how to use it so to reduce, death rates from dysentery, right? Whatever it was. And then if you could strip away the whole like Christianity and just European
Mhm.
culture in general, if you could strip away all of that stuff and just leave the like, here's how to have less of your babies die in childbirth, do with that what you will. In that hypothetical world that probably is actually impossible for any number of reasons, is the Prime Directive, you know is there, should there be a moral straitjacket on that as well as everything else? Does that make sense as a question? I'm not sure.
It makes sense as a question, and my short answer is no,
Okay,
because
please.
because divorcing a technological innovation from its cultural context is almost impossible. Because there's not a universal technological stages of development, in the same way there's not universal cultural stages. Like they go hand in hand. So like if you develop irrigation, it's not irrigation is a really good example. It is not a universally applicable technology because there's different kinds of water systems and biomes all over the planet. Like irrigation in the Amazon is a lot different than irrigation in the Near East, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a Near Easterner and you show up in the Peruvian Amazon saying, well, this is how we've watered our crops, like it's just not going to work. You have to adapt the system to the local context. And all technology is an adaptation to a localized regional context, even if the regional is like inward looking, like a city. Like we develop a new bus system to fit Fifth Avenue because Fifth Avenue's half the width of a normal New York street. You know, you can't carry that off to someplace else without some changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like if you're going to use a universal litmus test of technology to determine, well, we should give them X, Y, Z, or, you know, we should tell them about germ theory, like it's just not going to work out exactly like you've planned, because the local culture has to ingest it. And like throughout the European colonial period, a lot of those, it was a kind of a two-prong approach. One prong is accidental. Like they imposed cultural solutions from Europe on their colonial subjects.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, they had to adapt each and every one of them to the local context, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of lives were lost, especially when it comes to agriculture and disease and mosquito-borne diseases, because they couldn't figure out, well, why isn't X technology working here? You know, there's nothing wrong with sharing the information. Like if you tell the Vietnamese about germ theory before they understood it, as opposed to going in there and forcing them to start washing their hands, like they get to decide what to do with it and debate it. It'll take longer probably, but like that localized context is super important. Technology is not a universal anything. Like we think of it as universal stages. Like we've reached this level, but like they're all born in specific times and places and for very specific reasons. And universal applicability doesn't really apply. And it gets kind of thorny. You can find examples where maybe, you know, like space shuttles, rocket science, leaving the planet, there's only a couple different ways you can do that, right? But how that developed is going to be different everywhere, right? Like space travel only developed one way on Earth, and that's through the space race, through this geopolitical dick-waving contest between the Soviet Union and the United States. Nobody else has had a chance to do it a different way. Some of this is really hard to parse because like there's certain technologies, especially in a globalized world, only appear once and then they spread. But in the presentation at DragonCon, I found that the pre-Columbian Americas were an excellent natural like testing bed for how different technologies need particular context. The wheel, I brought up the wheel a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
The
yeah,
Inca
actually,
Empire,
I wanted to prompt you on. You talked about how like European attempts at adaptation actually failed in the Columbian context, and yeah, so I want to actually prompt you on that. So instead, I decided to interrupt you, but go for it.
no, it's okay. The wheel is a good example, right? It developed in the old world in a couple different places, probably on its own, and it developed in the new world in a couple of different places on its own, but they were never used to the same, you know, for the same application. And a lot of modern Westerners look back on places like Mesoamerica or the Inca Empire, and they're like, those fools, they never developed the wheel. Mm-hmm. But like the Inca Empire developed, you know, paved 25,000 miles of roads through the Andes Mountains, not some flat coastal plain, like through like one of the biggest mountain chains on Earth. Mm-hmm. Why? And they didn't have a wheel. They just didn't need it. You know, it just wasn't something that came up. And if you show up in a starship and then hand them a wheel, it's like, look, we have brought you the wheel. They would be like, that's nice. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. We have to think about this because it doesn't fit our context, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, that is a story as old as humanity itself, because these technological innovations and diffusions, cultural diffusions, bounce all over the planet, culture to culture, all the time. Half the stuff we do, half the stuff we use in our daily Western lives, half the words in our language come from some other place. And it's just like a part of being in human cultures, I guess.
Now, do you think there's anything, any kind of concept or anything that's defies that model, right? So I just this this factoid I learned today, and it is amazing to me, is that Aristotle apparently worked out a theory that women had, on average, fewer teeth than men did, through whatever pure deductive logic reasoning he did, and never actually, in once in his life, thought to actually go and count the amount of teeth in anybody's mouth, right? So, and so that's an example of how, like, the scientific method, you know, the scientific method itself had to be developed as much as any actual aspect of any scientific theory or what. Like, so my question is that could you cut down to any base layer that's that goes underneath or circumvents the kind of cultural uh individualities that you're talking about, say like the scientific method, or just evidence-based reasoning and whatever? Is there anything at kind of at that basic level that could circumvent the kind of individuality that you're talking about?
Yeah, the physical reality. So like if and this has happened, Indians, subcontinental Indians and Mayans, for example, have both studied the heavens and for different religious purposes and come away with some of the same mathematical constants. Like they know how long it takes for Venus to, move through the sky in any given year, or when the next solar eclipse might pop up. And it's because they've done the numbers. Like the closer you get to like a physical reality of describing the physical world that's a non-cultural world around you, I think the closer you might get to some kind of like, well, multiple cultures can figure out how to get to this place, even if they take their own path, if that makes any sense. So like science, that methodology, it sounds obvious in hindsight. It is a European cultural innovation, but it has popped up in various places in different flavors of it across the planet. And like anybody across 2 million years of Homo sapien evolution that's trying to figure something out is probably going to have done that, that method intuitively. When they're trying to build something, put 3 legs on a table and it keeps falling over, well, what am I doing wrong? So, but yeah, I think ultimately, yes, that there are some hard realities that you can't evade. There are physical limitations that cultures will bump into, and then they'll start to figure out what reality is like outside of the cultural bias and bubble.
So then would that then obligate, a person towards action? So say, the crew of the Enterprise shows up and, they don't do anything other than they say, hey, maybe if you make this prediction, maybe you should actually measure and check it, right? Like they don't do anything else. They don't hand out flintlocks or phasers or nuclear bombs or anything. They just do that. Is the act of that, or refraining from doing that, the inaction of not doing that, is that still a moral choice then? And is either one defensible or indefensible, if that makes sense as a question?
Yeah, it makes sense. Withholding information, society to society, generally is reprehensible in my moral view. And that's probably a thorny issue, but it's because like in Star Trek is in the Strange New Worlds premiere episode, Strange New Worlds, and in a private little war, this issue of like, if we give them weapons, they're not going to know how to use it pops up. If they have nuclear weapons, they're going to annihilate themselves. They don't know how to use it.
Right.
But in reality, human cultures don't go through those phases. Like everybody adapts to technology in different ways. Africa, the whole continent of Africa, 40 something individual nations, they kind of circumvented most of telecommunications of the early 20th century. They didn't lay telephone wire or build, telegram poles or anything like that. They skipped a lot of that and went straight on. All of those people are doing fine with communications. They've all figured out how cell phones work at the same rate and speed that we are, because human beings, we're not all, I mean, some of us are kind of dumb, but as a whole, we pick up on stuff pretty quickly and we plug them into our context. And right now, Africa is going like using cell phones to do microloans and circumnavigating a whole whole phases of what we think a modern society should traverse through in order to get to A or B or point C or whatever. So like, I think withholding information doesn't do, it stokes the feelings of superiority on behalf of those withholding information. I think that's about it.
Yeah.
You know,
So
if
you would say
hold,
that that's also in its own way tracing back to this sense of really like superiority, bigotry and
yeah,
ethnocentrism of
it's a
like
backhanded
our
compliment.
way. Yeah, our way is good, and we are going to bestow upon you the great gift of being like us.
Yeah, you are a child. If I give you this knife, you're going to cut yourself.
Right,
But
right,
human
right,
societies are not children.
right.
You know, it's not how they're. That's not an accurate way to think from culture to culture. Like looking at other cultures, like, oh, they're a child race. No, that's not. They've been here the same amount of time we've been here.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
And so there's uh there's this other aspect of the Prime Directive that gets thrown in. So the problem with the Prime Directive, at least as it's presented, is uh it's presented as many different things, and characters, the same character can feel many different ways about it depending on the episode and who's writing it, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that, probably should have said that up front, makes trying to just actually unravel the morality and ethics of it incredibly problematic, because it's like, what are you actually talking about here? And what is the defense, or what is the justification rather that you are actually employing in this particular instance, because that actually changes depending on the character and the episode and the writer. But one of the other aspects that does get thrown around multiple times through the franchise is kind of the sense of unintended consequences, right? Of the sense of like, if we intervene, then we are, I think this is probably most explicitly discussed in the TNG episode Homeward, which is where Worf's brother has decided he wants to help this culture and move them, and he sort of forces the Enterprise into doing this, even though Picard hates it for Prime Directive reasons, right? So it's this it's definitely, there's at least one scene where they discuss the sense of unintended consequences, like, okay, we have to choose what planet to move these people to, and so we're making these decisions for this culture that are going to have profound effects, and we have no idea how it's going to play out over thousands and thousands of years, right? And so in order to in order to spare ourselves the guilt of making the wrong choice, we're not going to choose at all. And I'm curious about your thoughts and your perspective from the cultural, anthropological standpoint of the validity of that, as if, because multiple characters over multiple episodes make the point of like, well, if we choose not to act, isn't that just as much of a choice as if we choose to act? And therefore, how is the guilt or whatever the moral consequences for us, how is it any different, right? So I was curious about your perspective and the anthropological perspective on that question.
If you're walking down the road and you come across a guy drowning, and your option is, do I save this man from drowning or do I let him drown? And your justification is, hold up, he doesn't know how to do the backstroke yet, I'm going to let him drown. It sounds sociopathic and monstrous. And I think, for me personally, that's what it is. And in the history of our real world Earth, like, it's never played out where you're doing anybody any favors by withholding something like that. Because human cultures will take an innovation or an idea and they'll make it their own, and it'll go in a direction you can't control anyway. So like these episodes of Star Trek, the beginning of Star Trek Into Darkness comes to mind, where they're gonna where they save the quote unquote primitive race from the volcano, violating the Prime Directive, and to do so, it all rests on this unilineal theory that if I interfere, that their later stages are going to be terrible. But like, because cultures evolve randomly, you have no idea if doing something or not doing something will result in a favorable cultural situation that you might recognize. Asterisk there, because you won't recognize it. Like when the Spanish showed up to the Aztec Empire, they found lots of reprehensible things to their cultural eyes. It didn't make any sense. Like the famous human sacrifices get thrown around a lot, but like they didn't understand the context of that. They just saw people get killed and they didn't understand it. And use that as justification for all kinds of things, withholding technologies, outright conquests, subjugating them afterwards. And like, but if you'd left the Aztec Empire alone, like, who knows what they would have done? There were people in Mesoamerica who had problems with the way their religions were being run, and problems specifically with the way the Mexica, the Aztecs, ran their religions and how
at the time, contemporary or just before
contemporary people,
actual contact,
right? Several people, and it gets funky because written records change and things got destroyed in the conquest. Whole libraries were burned down in Mesoamerica, but like, you could see on the ground, every society has this, every single one. No one is ever on the same page culturally. There's always a conversation at the minimum about this cultural practice, that attitude, this philosophy, that technology. And another society coming in without any understanding whatsoever about what's happening on the ground and deciding, you know what, you don't get oscillating fans, you're just not ready for that information. It's just it tells you more about the culture that's coming in than about the future colonial subjects, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and there's something rich in a society passing that judgment, like, because on the foundational level, I agree with the conquistadors in that respect of human sacrifice is bad.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that basic moral premise, but that conclusion and that judgment leveled by a society that at the same time has something called the Spanish Inquisition going on is a little rich, right? And so it again, it comes back to that sense of blind to my own ignorance question of, yeah, the Spanish were able to look at this situation and go, yeah, that's probably not great, but at the same time, we're, at least on a cultural level, I'm sure individuals, there's a great deal of variation on the individual level, but society-wide level, we're blind to their own kind of the equivalent on their own side of, well, we don't understand the reasons they're killing those people, so we're going to kill them until people are dying for reasons that we can understand, that makes sense to us, right? That seems like the situation that you end up with.
Everything we do, the way we perceive reality, everything goes through a cultural filter, and we have categories for every aspect of life, even things we don't imagine categories for, like the way we stand in line at a restaurant waiting to put in a to-go order. Mm-hmm. There's a category of cultural behavior for that. And it's not until you go someplace else when you realize, holy crap, I didn't realize I was doing it this way for any particular reason. I was just doing it, right? Mm-hmm. When you go overseas somewhere, the first thing that usually stands out to people is like, why are they putting their garbage there? Wherever it is, it doesn't matter. Like, people remark that Singapore is pretty, like, a remarkably clean place, but like, it really depends on where you're coming from for that to make an impression, right?
And also you have to understand the consequence of law and punishment in Singapore, which is very different from.
Right.
Yeah.
And, that context is hugely important. And a lot of the judgments that European powers in any culture across time, when they meet another culture, the natural instinct is to huddle up against your group. Oh, they're different. They're doing that way. That's weird. There's not like how we do it. And like, that is absolutely our default position. It takes, in my opinion, and I said this in the panel, it takes, I think that's the superior mindset that should be championed. Is like, when you realize that cultures can do things in different ways, instead of championing your own Eurocentric perspective. And the Federation, by applying a universal metric to other alien societies, is really saying to those societies, we are the epitome of cultural evolution. You have to meet our criteria to join the club. And every Prime Directive episode is colored that way. And for an unthinking Western audience watching that, they just take that at face value because their own culture is saying that about themselves. When we went into Vietnam, we carried that exact attitude with us. Mm-hmm. The soldiers on the ground described their situations in terms of like cowboys and Indians. Mm-hmm. They couldn't help it because that was the cultural water they came from. It's really hard to parse. It's not an easy thing. You have to kill some cherished myths in order to cross that bridge into understanding that, oh, this is not how cultures actually function. It's really hard to do sometimes.
Now, so as a, previously aspiring exobiologist turned anthropologist, Uh, and given how difficult it is on planet Earth, where all of us, despite all of our differences, share 99.99% DNA, do you think there's any hope that if we invented warp drive tomorrow and we flew it to Epsilon Eridani or wherever, and we discover a genuine, true alien culture, you know, that also has warp drive, whatever faster than light engine we built, they also built it. Um, do you think there's any hope of an actual, what's the best way to say this, of a better outcome in under those circumstances than humans have historically done in the colonial area at all?
Yes, for a couple of reasons. One is historical here. So we presume that Europe destroyed a bunch of other quote unquote primitive cultures because of a difference in technology or difference in cultural evolution. The fact of the matter is, especially with the Americas, it was disease that did most of the damage. If European diseases hadn't been a factor, there would be no Western people at all in North America, not in the way that it is now. So like understanding the context of the quote unquote bad decisions is important and is not easily acknowledged. Two, the resource game is most of the reason why we're stabbing each other down here on primate world, right? We want water, we need manpower, we need access to gold, and there's a limited supply of it. But out in the galaxy, that is not the same circumstance. Like it takes forever to get anywhere, even at warp drive, something Star Trek adamantly lies to us about. It doesn't take 3 days to get to Vulcan. It'll take you years, even at warp drive. And because of that, I mean, there's like bodies of material all over the place. Filled, like our asteroid belt is filled with precious metals, for example. We radically changed the computing industry here if we pulled in one asteroid. So like if you're like in Independence Day, you're zooming around looking for water, like, dude, there's so much water in the universe. You don't have to go kill someone for it. You could just go like liquidate, melt down a comet. It's not the same drive. Competition for resources wouldn't be possible. But the other thing, the most important thing, is that the aliens, whoever they are, they're not going to have culture. Culture is a human adaptation. It is a biological Darwinian evolutionary adaptation that evolved here. And because biological evolution doesn't ever have a repeatable path, like if you reset the clock here and let us evolve again, culture may not develop among the resulting creatures. So expecting to find a culture out there, I think, is the height of hubris. Whatever we find out there, it's not going to be on that level. It's not going to be like we imagine. We're not going to be able to go to their leader, introduce ourselves. They're not going to have a hierarchy like that. And they would have evolved a radically different context, nothing like the Earth has ever produced. And I think that's an important distinction to remember. So all those aliens we see in Star Trek, like those are, obviously it's fiction talking about humans dealing with other humans, but like actual aliens, you're not really going to talk to them that easily.
Yeah, that's part of it that I think we also tend to forget, is that all of Star Trek really is a parable for humans dealing with humans, right? It's not, which is most visually apparent when it's the alien is just got a little bumpy thing on their forehead. But whatever the real universe and real space exploration, should it ever happen to that degree, looks like, that will not be a parable for the Cold War or the War on Terror or whatever. It will just be self-evidently on its face, for its own sake, an alien thing. So right. Do you think, so taking it to that level, do you think there's any sense of any kind of common level, maybe you don't want to call it culture, maybe you want to use a different term, but some, presuming that there is an alien intelligence out there roughly equivalent to ours, that there would be any way to even communicate with them in a way that is like, I think, therefore I am, and I understand the same is true for you. And then building on some kind of, again, don't use the word culture if you don't want to, but cultural exchange or cultural interface.
Exchange of knowledge.
Yeah.
I mean, I hope yes. A lot of the things we consider universal, like math, counting, is a very cultural thing. And it's hard to get outside of our own heads about that to find out, well, what would bridge the gap to somebody who doesn't have a culture that is still somehow intelligent enough to understand their place in the universe. There's really, I mean, who knows? Like, that is going to be the wildest possible shock to the system ever experienced by humans. But I'll give you an example here on Earth. Octopuses are very intelligent, and we don't understand why. There's no basis of similarity between the two of us as a species. And they're so intelligent, they only live for like a couple of years, like 3 or 4 years, depending on the species. And like, they're so brief. And what are we to make with that? Like, we can obviously interact with them, but like, we can never know how they're feeling. They can never know what we mean by saying the word lonely. They just don't have it in their, awareness. And yet they know exactly how to like open jars, escape from aquariums, capture prey, change colors. Like, they're some of the most intelligent animals in the ocean, and they're just like the most alien things compared to us. And I think you take that times a million for an alien species.
And that's the thing, right? Because an octopus probably does have a concept of loneliness. They probably feel, or if not octopuses, cetaceans, or maybe even pachyderms, right? They probably have some concept of something that is roughly equivalent to our sense of loneliness, right? But is there any way to actually bridge that gap, which I guess is a question of communication? And I don't know that there is.
I actually think that there is, for Earth-based creatures, because there's a shared biology. There's at some level, some shared software, right? Elephants are a really great example because they're mammals, and our cultural sensibilities, the evolution of human culture as a survival tool produced by Darwinian evolution, has its origins in social hierarchical mammals. So like, elephants understand what it means to be lonely, no doubt, because they have to deal with that. They stick together in a group. For us, groups are supremely important. Humans do not survive without being enculturated. These wild children that get left out in the woods or raised by wolves or accidentally whatever, and they miss the language acquisition window, the only way we can get enculturated, they never physically develop. They never become, and they can't. Like, after, even if you take them and tutor them the rest of their lives, like, a lot of those people, they just don't make it as far as the rest of us. We die without culture. Our adaptations are so intertwined around that. Elephants are very similar in that regard. A lonely elephant doesn't live as long. They have that need, and there's an evolutionary need or reasons for that. And it's because, like, a survival in the group kind of thing. Culture is a very specific flavor of that. Ants, very specific flavor of that. We have a lot more in common with ants than pachyderms, but like, octopuses are a good example because they don't have that, right? So do they feel loneliness? If we hooked up technological devices that'll zap thoughts between brains, can I say I'm lonely and it'll make sense to an octopus? They don't have a herding instinct. They came from a completely different lineage of creature that predates all that mammalian biology. And you can, like I said, magnify that times 1,000 to get to an actual alien species on a completely different planet where none of the same biology is running around. And like, there's no shared software. Like, so how do you bridge that gap? Man, if you can figure it out, you're going to win yourself all the Nobel Prizes, all the statues, all the high schools named after you.
Well, I think we've taken an important step here on this podcast for sure. Like, this is definitely step one, and I'll be sending it to the Nobel Committee. No,
they accept podcasts as proof, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, podcasts are the highest form of cultural discussion. I think as a as a male podcast, white male in his 30s, I can confidently say that.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So I'm just looking through my notes here, like, because there's that's the thing about the Prime Directive. Like, there's some great episodes based around it. It really is a fascinating kind of philosophical and moral concept. And I still feel like, even over what is it, 56 years, 50 plus years, and hundreds of hours of screen time, it's still like barely scratched the surface of what is really what the real depth and weight of that concept is. Um, so is there any aspect of the Prime Directive that you've thought about either in putting together this this video or just thinking about the topic in general that you're like, man, I wish an episode would tackle that? Like that to me is the real nuance or the real meat of it, and I haven't seen an episode really dig at that particular aspect of it.
I think that in the DragonCon panel, I talked about maybe the real Prime Directive is recognizing the multilineal evolutionary model as, like you recognize cultures can go in different directions. I don't need to hold things back from you. But the other side of that, and it's like a backhanded compliment in this way, the other side of the Prime Directive is that I, as a culture, will let you make your own decisions. And I think there's something important there. Like, because the sins of colonialism are that Western powers didn't let cultures make their own decisions. They made them for them. So if the Spanish show up in Mexico and say, here is a flintlock gun, good luck. Or here's what we know about the planetary orbits, which the Aztecs, inherited a model for themselves. Like, if you just talk to people and let them make their own decisions based on the new information, I think that is the most admirable aspect to it. And maybe Star Trek would have some more modern mileage as far as Prime Directive material if they talked about it in that regard. If that was the moral dilemma, if I give them information, not impose it, but let them make decisions about the new information, maybe that's the dimension I haven't seen explored all that much. Because like in A Private Little War, Kirk was all ready to arm everybody. Like, Scotty, let's make 100 flintlock rifles. He didn't really ask them.
Right.
He didn't ask those people. Like, I would like to make guns for you and what are you going to do with them? Like, I think that would have been a radically different moral dilemma for Kirk.
That's actually a great point, right? Because in the episode you have, so it's a very quick recap. Kirk had been on the planet a long time before and had made friends with the guy who is now the chief. The chief is married to this terrible stereotype of a medicine woman, Lady Desdemona kind of trope thing. But while Kirk is wrestling with this, do we do this? Do we arm them? Do we not arm them? The wife makes her position very clear repeatedly and uses all of the levers at her disposal to get the outcome she wants. But to your point, Kirk never really has just a sit-down conversation with his old friend, the chief, the tribe leader, about like, this is the situation. What do you think? Is your people who are at risk? It's your people whose lives would be put on the line. What do you want? And that's actually a very interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible how simple and straightforward that is, and yet how harshly it defies kind of the tropes that Star Trek has played to all of these times, from TOS up to Strange New Worlds.
That's a blind spot for Star Trek, because it's a blind spot for the United States of America, our culture. When we talk about foreign nations, we openly on our national television talk about, well, maybe we should bomb Iran. And the Iranians can hear that. We're making decisions about the fates of other nations without their input at all, and we consider that to be normal. And Star Trek, kind of, because it's US people writing it mostly, like, they've inherited that without unthinkingly. How different would the Prime Directive episodes be if they approached it from that angle, as opposed to. And what's cool about that episode was that his wife Nuna, whatever her name is, and Tyree, like, at the start disagreed about the weapons. Like, he wasn't predisposed to wanting to acquire them, and she definitely wanted them. And I think that's a nice metaphor for any society when they're confronted with something new, because there's always going to be conversation and disagreement over that. We're having the problem right now with coal-fired power plants. Like, they're ruining everything. Should we keep them? Should we not? We can't come to an agreement on that. No society cleanly comes to an agreement on anything. And I think that's something that Star Trek glosses over really monocultural aliens everywhere.
Yeah. Well, it's actually, to not to spoil out the story of Tempest too much, but in season 3, which is what we're recording right now, we sort of have that question where the Prime Directive prohibits the Federation from helping, but everybody knows self-evidently on its face that this is a fucked up situation. And you have one group of people from this planet asking for help, but they're not the quote unquote official people, right? They're not the right people. The right people are in the bag for the bad guys. And so the debate is like, well, we know what's going on. How hard do we have to pretend that this is not, bullshit on its face to look ourselves in the mirror in the morning?
That's an interesting way to tackle that, I think.
Yeah. There's so many different ways to get at the meat of that basic. There's a lot of meat left to be mined in the Prime Directive.
I think so.
And we have spent an hour barely scratching the surface of it. So you're gonna have to come back at some point, and we'll continue. Maybe after we get to that, release that episode in season 3, you can come back and we can just get into more of the nuance of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Kyle. That is an hour, so we'll cut it there. Even though I don't know about you, I could go all day. Not that
I mean, it's an endless font of a topic,
Yeah. I could probably literally talk for days, just have a whole convention seminar around the Prime Directive and all of its. We'll do that. We'll do a whole track next year at DragonCon.
Hey, why not? That sounds fun.
I'm sure Garrett will be on board. All right, but until then, thank you very much for joining me, Kyle, and having this discussion. Thank you everybody for joining us. If you stuck around, and if you did, props. Kyle, tell our audience where they can find you online and your stuff.
You can find us at shrexpertise.com if you like video essays about science fiction and mostly Star Trek. I'm also available for bar mitzvahs and birthday parties through screendoorpictures.com, depending on your flavor. And yeah, I'm on Twitter and everywhere, but I'm sure you'll have to look for my name in the description. Neoteotihuacan is hard to spell. People don't have time
just real quick. God, I shouldn't jump back into things after we already just started the outro. But so you talk about where that name comes from. You mentioned it briefly at the panel.
Yeah, so it's kind of philosophy, like a personal, like I'm a big fan of history and pre-Columbian America, and I do a lot. I'm reading this really nice history of the Lakota right now. Like I like to, that's where I like to spend my free time. But so Teotihuacan as a city in Mexico is one of the largest metropolitan areas in pre-Columbian North America. It's massive, and nobody knows really who built it. The Toltecs probably. And it's impressive. Pyramids of the Moon. It's a big city. You can go visit it. It's like 15 minutes north of Mexico City. And Neo, just sort of like, I am a citizen of North America, and I'm casting one eye to the past and one eye to the future. Teotihuacan is like our oldest city and our oldest big city.
New Teo. I'm not going to be able to pronounce it correctly.
Teotihuacan.
Teotihuacan.
Yeah.
There you go. Neo-Teotihuacan.
There you go.
That's very cool. Anyway, all right. So this is the real outro, I promise. Go check out Kyle at his YouTube channel, Trexpertise. You can find him also on Twitter under Neo-Teotihuacan.
Neo-Teotihuacan. Yes.
Wakan. And in the meantime, you also know where to find Starship Tempest at Starship Tempest on Twitter. You can find me, Brian Pinifter, on Twitter. And until next time, we will see you out there.